we live? We are. Hey, good afternoon. How are you? Doing well. I am really excited to be in Stockholm with all of you. It's my first time here. It's been wonderful to learn about the initiatives that have been underway here in this city over the last couple of days, but I think it's been really great to just hear more of a global perspective around the challenges that are inherent to placemaking and this new urban agenda that's being crafted. Just very quickly about who I am and what I do. I help run a consulting firm called Street Plans. We're based in Miami, San Francisco, and New York, which is where my office is. My business partner, who Chuck mentioned, Tony Garcia, could not be with us today. A lot of our work comes out of advocacy and trying to share best practices and knowledge from the things that we're passionate about and the things we've been inspired by from others in our career. So we've created a whole bunch of different kinds of publications that are, for the most part, online and free that are advocating for new kinds of places and cities and neighborhoods. The placemaking and tactical urbanism part of this is just one part of the work that we do at Street Plans, but it's certainly been a really critical part for attracting change makers in various cities. So we work very much with nonprofit organizations, very bottom-up grassroots, and with cities and city planning departments, et cetera, as clients. So frequently we get asked to help redesign or rethink streets. So those principal public spaces that we talked a lot about this morning, and this happens to be outside of the city of St. Louis in the middle part of the United States. And we look at the balance of public space for people versus those driving, and it's not so good. So when we create a vision, the client wants us to say, how do you make this more bikeable and walkable? Awesome. There it is. There's a vision. There's a pretty picture. But the question always remains, now what? You've created your pretty image, and moving that to implementation is clearly a lot more challenging. And I didn't know this as a young planner leaving graduate school and going into the field. I always figured that you have this beautiful picture, this beautiful image, and of course, things will just happen. You don't get taught necessarily all the political challenges and battles and the funding and all those things that can be really tough to move vision into practice. So this question came up very early on in my career. I was very fortunate to be living and working in Miami, working for a great consulting firm there. And it was, how do we create this culture shift? And it was not just about the culture shift of cities, which is a huge challenge, right? Cities at large. But how do we create a culture shift within the discipline, within the field of urban planning? And that became a very large interest of mine, and particularly coming out of an experience of working on a project that was in Miami, and it was all about rezoning the entire city all at once. Taking one zoning code, throwing it into the dumpster, and starting anew with a brand new vision for the city. Now, that was a very ambitious, exciting project for a young planner. I also realized pretty quickly that that process in which that was taking place was one that was really challenged in terms of reaching a wide audience of people to really understand, what does change mean for us on my block in my house if this whole new zoning code happens? And communicating that to the public has always been, I think, a challenge in our field. So it was through some advocacy work in that city where we got a cycling initiative going with the mayor's office. And the very first initiative out of the gate was called Bike Miami Days. And this was a huge aha moment for me, because there were now thousands of people in the streets on a weekend morning when there normally were not very many people in the downtown at this time. This is 2008. And this was what I call a rendering in real time. All of a sudden, I could see real smiling faces, real people, not Photoshop people, enjoying what Miami could be to become a more cycle and pedestrian-friendly place. And this was a critical moment when the city decided to take a new approach to allow for cycling to start to proliferate. And at this point, this is 2008 again, the city was voted to be ranked one of the top 3 worst cities in America for cycling. So it was a really opportune moment to shift that dialogue. And so we've continued to follow this stream of thought on how we can temporarily close off streets and open them up to people for a variety of different kinds of activities. We've seen this huge growth across North America, in the States, Canada, Mexico, and of course, cities in South America have been doing this for a long time, on how we re-envision what streets can be. And provide a couple of different platforms and best practices for doing just that in your community. But what's been most interesting in the last couple of years is seeing how open streets has become this word platform has been used a lot today, how it's become a platform for enabling people to not just experience a street that's more friendly to them as a person, but how we can actually think about with the infrastructure that can, in a more permanent way, allow us to have more bike and pedestrian friendly cities. So the use of temporary projects while you have a captive audience of thousands of people has proven in lots of cities to be very, very effective, very inexpensive, very effective ways to communicate. And North American cities are finally onto this idea. This is the Los Angeles Department of Transportation, a big bureaucratic beast, is now thinking about how open streets are on the front end of a change-making process. And they have this event called Cicla Via, which happens in LA 4 or 5 times a year, attracts more than 100,000 people each time that it happens, at the scale of about 10 to 15 miles open for biking and walking. And then they use a program called People Street, which is all about enabling community organizations to do their own interventions. So they have a palette of materials, a kit of parts, so to speak. Neighborhood groups can access that material and create change in their own neighborhoods. And then those elements can add up to create a streetscape plan, right? So how many of you are planners? All right, most of you, a lot of you. Oftentimes as planners, we get asked to jump right to the streetscape plan. Like just envision and create a whole new vision for this place. That is your expertise. And I think all these interim, shorter term uses in our neighborhoods and on our streets allows us to actually experience what's working, what's not, in a little bit more of a real way that can inform this longer term planning process. And of course, it's not just about cycling or walking either. This is about community, creating better connections in our cities with people who may not be exactly like us. This is a great image from open streets in the city of Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, just about a month ago. Stockholm, and I know a lot of other cities are onto this as well, as a way to bring about different ideas in public space. Second inspiration for me, again, I look a lot to other people and the work that's being done around the world, and this was New York City, and I think a lot of you know of this project, so I don't need to describe it in detail, the transformation that's happened on our streets, but I think what people don't know is there was a plan for Broadway, this now iconic temporary transformational project. There's a plan proposal in 1969 to pedestrianize that street. But you can imagine getting all of those people politically on board with permanent infrastructure to close off Manhattan's main street would be very, very difficult. And of course it was. And so I think this is part of the story that nobody brings up with the transformation around Times Square, et cetera, is that this was really a 40-year-old vision or 45-year-old vision. So it was the lawn chairs that initiated this change. I think if the Department of Transportation came forward and said, here's a permanent vision for the master plan for Times Square and dropped that in, it wouldn't have worked very well. People would have rejected that outright. It was the use of the very temporary and trial materials and approach, the very simple lawn chairs for one weekend that led to this understanding that life would go on in the city, even if Times Square didn't have any cars. So then the next step came was just paint on the ground, umbrellas and chairs. You know the whole story. The impact of this has been well documented on, particularly around safety, that people are a lot safer now in the streets in this area because of the pedestrian orientation. And then finally in 2013, this vision by the architecture firm Snøhetta was developed for permanent transformation with permanent infrastructure. And last summer it was under construction. So 2009 to 2014, a 5-year timeline for delivering lawn chairs to permanent infrastructural upgrades for placemaking. And it's this power of iterative design that I think politically helps us understand how change can happen in our cities, but can also allow for some small-scale failures to happen. As if we as designers can completely plan everything and get it perfect right off the bat. When you spend millions of dollars to start, it's really expensive or difficult to go back in and fix some of those things in the hard infrastructure. So this temporary approach can be very valuable. And it's very much akin to a process, it's called build, measure, and learn. And the impetus here is just get something done on the ground for people to measure and evaluate and say, yes, this is working or this is not working, learning from those elements and those early projects, those pilot projects, and then feeding it back into your design process so you have a few different revolutions. And so this is just like the Times Square approach and model. But not every city has a visionary mayor or Department of Transportation. Not every city is Los Angeles, and in most places actually that's not the case, not only in the US, but I think globally. And so what happens, when you as a person, you as a group of neighbors, you as an advocate want to deliver change? And there's really inspiring stories that we've been collecting for quite some time, and this is one of them in the city of Dallas, Texas, where a group of organized neighborhood residents went out and they wanted to transform their street. They had a very dangerous street for walking, a lot of vacant buildings, no businesses, no retail was surviving in this area. And so they created a project called Build a Better Block. And the idea is not a whole neighborhood transformation, not the whole thing all at once. Let's start with a single block and see what can happen there first. And so this was the temporary materials they threw out into the middle of the street. They pulled a block party permit from the city to allow them to do this, but they actually kept the street open to cars. They just took away a lane of traffic. And what made this project tactical is that they circled every single ordinance and zoning code regulation that they were violating as part of this project. And they put that up on each project element and said, this is illegal, this is illegal, this is illegal, and this is illegal. And so when their city councilor was invited and showed up and saw all the people in the street, families running around having a great time, vacant buildings that had life for the weekend, the councilor said, this is fantastic. Why don't we do this all the time? And they could point to every single element saying, we're not allowed to, or it's very expensive or difficult to create this kind of change. And it was a big aha moment for that city. And so the couple lead proponents behind this project have been hired multiple times to come back and Build a Better Block with a variety of Dallas neighborhoods, including more that are underserved than their own. It's also helped the city program a pretty dead City Hall Plaza space. So this is the front of Dallas City Hall, where once a month they have the Dallas Living Plaza initiative. And it allows people who don't maybe have a brick and mortar business quite yet to come down and test out their ideas with a captive audience. There's music and there's food and it's a good time. And it shows us that the hard infrastructure really does matter in public space design, but it doesn't matter that much. If you can bring people together in a way that's fun and engaging, then the actual design particularities of the space tend to fade away, at least in a temporary way. And taking risks, like they did in Dallas, can really pay off. And this is a great article headline about a little quick project in New Haven, Connecticut. Some of you might know New Haven as being the home of Yale University. And it was a guerrilla crosswalk installation in the middle of the night that was done illegally that helped actually show the city there was a real desire and need to create safer spaces at intersections, particularly this one. And so the bottom of the image here, you see a drawing for this intersection upgrade in New Haven, exactly where that crosswalk was painted. And I love pointing this example because it shows you that cities have two possibilities when this happens. They can crack down on this behavior and say, that's unsanctioned and illegal, and we won't stand for it. You might get arrested next time, or we're going to make you pay a fine. Or they can say, hey, that's really interesting. We understand that you're advocating for something that we have the unique ability to do with you. Why don't we come in behind this and make it a better place for you and your neighborhood? And that's the path that New Haven took, and that's the path that Dallas took in many other cities. And I get really inspired by those kinds of responses because they seem to be much more proactive about change making. And by the way, the person who made that guerrilla crosswalk was then voted in to office as a city alderman because he showed his leadership with his community, right? And then he was asked to be the chief of transportation for the city of New Haven. So I often like to say that you might be out there trying to fight the man, and then you might just become him as well. Interesting story. So what these projects have in common is that they are tactical. And I know this has a very negative militaristic connotation for a lot of people, and that's fine. But I think if you look at the actual definition in the dictionary, it really describes what was not only happening top down in a way in New York City, but also what's happening bottom up in New Haven and Dallas. It's all about these very short-term actions to create long-term change. And so we've been documenting this movement for quite some time now. Some of you might have downloaded some of our publications or read our work on this. But it's fascinating. It still remains fascinating to see how these unsanctioned neighborhood-scale, neighborhood-based projects happen and then inspire long-term transformation and policy change or physical infrastructure change. And so we document that shift from unsanctioned to sanctioned. And so we've got 4 different online publications on this subject. The first one being written in 2011. that we put up online, and I was very surprised when a lot of people actually read this thing and shared it beyond my immediate nerd urbanist group of friends. But so we did a second volume, which we've translated into Spanish and Portuguese, a third volume with a great NGO based in Santiago, Chile, called Ciudad Emergente, and they documented examples in their context in South America, which is a great help, I think, in the movement. And then we worked just last summer and fall with Lucinda Hartley, who's over here from Co-Design Studio in Melbourne, to focus on Australia and New Zealand and how tactical urbanism is translating to that context. So each one of these guides for us was, has basically been an iteration that has led up to our full-length book, which just came out this past spring, where we dive a lot deeper into these into this movement, its history, applications, etc. It really, truly has become this global movement. I think it's part and parcel with placemaking at large. It's this global movement of people who are trying to create much better places, no matter where they are in the world. And maybe this is the statement that is most in line with Bruce Katz's American, flowery big language, but I think it's actually really interesting and true to see how people around the globe are using this as a tool. So the book itself, I won't dwell on this at all, but there's some really interesting historical precedents that we found through our work here, and mostly it allowed us a chance to kind of take a breath and put a definition to what this has become. And I think it's important to underscore that the city-led can be organizationally led or citizen-led approach to neighborhood scale projects with short-term, low-cost, and scalable interventions that are intended to catalyze long-term change. And so I underscore and hyphenate often the word intended, because from the very beginning, the whole idea is that you do have a vision. You do want to improve things for the long term for yourself and your community, but you're starting very small incrementally. It's allowing for this very purposeful approach that isn't linear. It's knowing that you're going to make mistakes, you're going to have challenges that come up all along the way, and you can't solve for 30 years out today. So back to the history. Here's a great example of portable parks. This was maybe the first pop-up park, so to speak, that happened in San Francisco in 1970. This was an artist-led project where somehow this artist got permission to put a park on a freeway on-ramp in San Francisco. And that led to a couple more projects of the same type, using these very temporary materials as the sod. She got farm animals donated as well for the project. The whole point was to create a commentary on the impact, the negative impact that automobile-based infrastructure was having on her city for her neighborhood. The Dutch Woonerf is this really great example that we dug up from early 1970s. The Woonerf as we know it, and though a lot of you might know this being from Europe as a street type that's pretty commonly accepted today. How do you prioritize walking, cycling, and just slow movement in a neighborhood environment? But this project, as I learned, was started with guerrilla overnight activism. So in the city of Delft in the Netherlands, people on this very street went out in the middle of the night and they strategically removed asphalt to create big potholes. And the idea was, well, this will slow down the cars, including our own. And the city responded by hearing about this project, and they checked it out. And I like to say that the Dutch are very, very practical people, and they've observed this and said, it's working. It should stay. And over time, this got more formalized, and to see the bike parking and the tree and the landscaping, and it's a pretty commonly accepted street design now. Less so in the United States, but we're working on that. Another historical example, 1997, the history of this project called Intersection Repair. How many of you have heard of this or seen this project before? Just a few hands. Okay. This is a project that actually didn't start in the middle of the street, but started in somebody's backyard. Mark Lakeman, architect and urbanist, had traveled the world, and he came back to his hometown of Portland, Oregon, and realized that he didn't have the kind of community place to gather that he wanted, so he built a tea house in his backyard, which is that top left image. It was technically illegal, so the city asked him to take it down. He did, but he was prepared for that. So he took the materials from the tea house and he put it on the back of his truck. And that's what you see in the middle image there, which is the tea horse. So the tea horse started to move around Portland, creating a neighborhood gathering point for people to have conversations about community and placemaking there. And then finally, from that initiative, they decided to take this mobile idea and root it back into the community. So they pulled a block party permit, which is a kind of a event permit structure that most cities in the United States have. And instead of actually having a party, the party was actually painting the street into a plaza. And they built all these little kiosks and benches and structures around the neighborhood plaza to help enliven the space and make it more comfortable for people. And the city went ballistic at first when they saw that this happened. Like, how could you paint the roadway? No one give you permission to do this? And they said, well, we went to every single person in this neighborhood, and they agreed that this was a good idea. Many of them came out and actually helped us make this plaza, and we really want to advocate for it to stay. And a city councilor named Charlie Hale, who's now the mayor of Portland, championed this, realized that this was a good project. And very soon thereafter, the city of Portland started to work on a one-page ordinance, which is this, that allows anybody in their neighborhood to get together with very basic conditions to create their own plaza. And so this project has happened all over that city and now actually all over the globe. And then finally, the famous Parking Day. A lot of people know about this, right, as this sort of tactical urbanism placemaking holiday that happens once a year, third Friday in September. This happened in San Francisco in 2006 as an installation by a group called Rebar. And the whole point was to expose a loophole. And the loophole was that nowhere did it say in the city regulations that you couldn't do something with a parking space as long as you paid the meter. You didn't have to put a car there. So instead, they put a park. And this is now, again, in the history of communication, this is now 2006, so we have the internet. And this very image got shared with thousands and thousands of people all over the globe, which then led to this huge surge of interest of, this is something that I can do today. This is something I can do in my own neighborhood. I can put quarters in my own parking space or reclaim this parking space and start a dialogue about what's possible here. And of course, we now know that hundreds of cities participate in Parking Day globally every year. And it's led to the parklet movement, which is an interesting transformation of all these spaces into semi-more permanent spaces that are public for the use in very different capacities in different neighborhoods. But we're mapping this right now as part of a project with the city of San Francisco, and we're looking at all the spaces that have been done or planned to come online. And all of a sudden, the parklet doesn't look so small anymore. The parklet's not just about the block level little intervention that can be cutesy and kind of fun. What's really important here is that in aggregate, this is totally making a different level of public space and public realm in that city. I think that's the potential, is not necessarily just on the block, but how this over time can catalyze better spaces in our cities. That better block idea, though, it translates to different contexts. Does anyone know the city of Memphis in the U.S.? A few people. It's a wonderful city. It's also a very poor city. It's also a city that is, to put it into context for all of you who know Detroit, which is probably more of you, it's got the exact same population of Detroit with double the land mass, right? So same population, double the land mass. So if you think Detroit is empty, you've not yet been to Memphis. They've got a lot of challenges and issues there. But anyways, they took the same better block approach, and what was phenomenal in their example is that with $20,000 of foundation funding and just neighborhood group getting together to reactivate a neighborhood center that was completely vacant. There were 4 blocks here, almost entirely every building was vacant, no businesses, et cetera. And they took this approach, and within a few years' time, there was this huge surge of investment to reactivate, bring this neighborhood back online. As a colleague and friend of mine says, his name's Tommy, and he lives and works in Memphis, he says this project put this neighborhood back on the mental map of Memphians. It showed them what was possible. And so with the 15,000 people who came out that one weekend, it translated into the kind of stats that you see, including the whole neighborhood being renovated. But I think what's most important, too, is that a city has a very unique ability, a city government has a very unique ability to take a project like that happens with the special magic of committed people organizing together, and the city's role and possibility is to scale that citywide, to allow that opportunity in other neighborhoods where maybe it's not happening as organically if people so choose to take part in this kind of thing. And so here you see the Memphis mayor, A.C. Wharton, talking about the need for them to work in this manner. They don't have big bucks and big resources to transform every neighborhood. So they need to start with the weekend-long, small-scale interventions to bring about the conversations and the possibilities of long-term change. And here's just an image of what that looks like on the ground there. This is a recent MemFix project, as they call it. And they do these quarterly in a variety of different neighborhoods. And this mindset starts to really take a hold in a city. It's not just about city government or one activist group. This is a whole private and public sector kind of joint project relying on a lot of neighborhoods, a lot of volunteers to come together to create change. And this is their Tennessee Brewery, which was a historic building that was sat vacant for quite some time. It was about to be demolished. No project developer could figure out how to transform this building and make it work economically. It was too expensive to bring it up to code, to bring in the elevators, all the rest. And so it was about to be demolished until they put a pop-up beer garden into the courtyard of this space. You see the middle image there. For 5 weeks, during a festival time called Memphis in May. And what happened after this event was pretty extraordinary. Not only did they take the $35,000 of bare minimum investment to get the building habitable for 5 weeks and a lot of volunteer labor, but they turned that around into $265,000 worth of beer sales. And those investments, as the proponents say, was a market study. That's what showed that this is a viable building with viable uses if you only start at the ground floor as opposed to thinking about the whole building as one big project. And it brought a whole lot of attention. It brought a whole lot of people to this space. So that 3 months later, a developer stepped forward and said, actually, I figured out how I can make this work. We're going to save the building, and we're going to develop the vacant lot across the street. And so the beer garden event happened again this spring. And so it's going to be this temporary use until over time they redevelop the building. So this movement is based on 4 key things, I think. It's shifting demographics. We've heard a lot about the cities becoming more populated and more desired places for people to live around the globe. Citizen frustration. It is so difficult to get the most simple thing done if you go through the sanction process in a lot of cities. So people are tired of waiting 10 months and $1,000 to put flowers on the sidewalk, for example. So there's new processes that cities are now creating to allow for this kind of stuff to flourish, to make it easier for people to make their neighborhoods better places. The Great Recession, I think, called a lot of places back down to earth, so to speak, in terms of resources and finances. And tactical urbanism was a tool to allow for momentum to be continued without having to spend a lot of money. And then this final notion, I mentioned it, radical connectivity. It's not my term, it's someone else's, to describe how much communication power we have in our pockets with our phones. I see a lot of you taking photos. You can tweet something here, and someone back from where you're from can see it quickly, understand it visually, and start thinking about how do I apply this kind of project where I am today. So these ideas spread very quickly. And as I've explained, it's bottom up, it's top down, and it's everything in between. How am I doing on time, Chuck?
You've got about 4 minutes.
4 minutes?
5 minutes.
Okay. I'm going to very quickly end with just 3 quick project examples from how we, as a planning practice, as consultants working with our clients, have integrated this into our work. Here's an example from Hamilton, Ontario. It's one of Canada's poorer cities. It's near Toronto. It's about 45 minutes south of Toronto. And there's a group there called the Hamilton Burlington Society of Architects, and a very well-respected professional group that wanted to move their own city government forward on implementing change that was written into their plans and policies, but was not translating to change on the ground. So we ran a tactical urbanism workshop with about 30 people there in the spring of 2013. And we selected 5 sites, and the architecture organization put up $1,000 for each of the 5 sites, which were representative of difficult conditions there physically for safety in terms of walking. And so we came up with this whole mantra for the project, which was to calm these intersections, reclaim this space, and then recreate it for the long term. We use a planning process we call 48 by 48 by 48, which is 48 hours, 48 months, and 48 weeks and 48 months. And with the 48 months, the idea is that long-term planning is actually very difficult to do. Politics change, financing change, social demographics change. And this is an approach that says, look, let's try to plan at most 4 years into the future, and then let's work backwards to what we can get started literally this weekend. What can we do very quickly? And so on Locke Street, where one of these intersections was located, became the first project that had this huge impact there. And the story was that this is an intersection that had the Locke Street was at Commercial Street, and then Herkimer Street intersects it. And it's a 2-lane street, which featured fast-moving traffic, particularly in the morning when kids were trying to walk to school. And so this is my client, so to speak, Graham, an otherwise respected architect, in the middle of the night screwing in cones into the asphalt. And his intent here is to create a curb extension to shorten the crossing distance for pedestrians. Now, what he learned very quickly, remember that mantra, build, measure, learn? He learned very quickly that screwing cones into asphalt is not a very good idea. But beyond that, he also learned that his neighborhood loved the result. And this is the crossing guard who they interviewed the next day to get feedback on what they did in the middle of the night. So I came back to Hamilton after 5 of these different projects were done. The whole point was I would share in a much larger public lecture what had been done in this 2-week period. The local paper picked up on this. I gave my lecture. I went home. I felt good. People were excited about these projects that they did. I don't have time to share all of them. But then it was 8 days later that this headline hit the local blog. And so the city issued an internal memo saying, gosh, I think we're experiencing this tactical urbanism. It's dangerous and unsafe. We need to crack down on this. So remember, right, you have these 2 decisions as a city. You can either look to see how you can enable and bring something forward, or you can crack down on it. Hamilton started with the crackdown. So the public fought back. This is their very cheeky poster, and I've long thought that Canadians were super polite people, and turns out maybe not so much. Do not approach the tactical urbanists directly. This one, you see something remotely progressive, report it. Right? So it introduces humor into this conversation that was, until this point, very tense. 8 days later, this is the headline now in the national publication, CBC. And so they stepped out of the darkness, this otherwise very well-known group of architects, and said, we are behind this, but we're trying to push you forward. 4 days later, the city had this quote-unquote master plan for that intersection, high visibility crossing and curb extensions in the exact same locations. 5 days later, it was in the ground. Right? So it shows you how quickly cities can act when they give a damn. When they want to move something forward, they know they have the political will and support to do it. So they actually found so much positive feedback on this project from not only the neighborhood where it occurred, but neighborhoods all over Hamilton, and they started saying, this feels really good. It feels really good to get positive feedback. We should do more of this. And they set out to do just that. So they created a pilot program for intersection upgrades that by September of that year had changed 67 different intersections around Hamilton. And then by this spring, actually, when I asked Graham to come to our book launch party, I asked him, how many have you done? He said 102 different intersections. Very short-term projects, very small in scale, that made a really big rippling impact throughout that city. I guess I'm going to move to just one more, and then I'll stop, given the time. But also as, how do you test design alternatives? So as planners, we create these visions, these longer-term plans. Maybe you come up with a couple different options on what to implement, and then you go to the community and say, which one do you like? And sometimes you get good feedback. Sometimes people don't really give you a positive way forward. So the idea here is to actually take your designs and translate them to something on the ground so people can actually experience them, before, make a more informed decision, since most people don't actually read plans and urban design ideas like we do as professionals and as advocates. So in this project in a community called Morgan Hill, California, we were asked to participate on the backside of a Complete Streets project. Those of you who don't know, Complete Streets is all about making changes to our transportation infrastructure, to our public realm, to make it more inviting for all people to move around and be there as opposed to just automobiles. And so for a long time in Morgan Hill, they had been debating a 4-lane Main Street, which was moved a lot of cars, was not very attractive to people. And every time they brought up taking away lanes of traffic, this was the result. People freaked out. And the idea here was that, well, why don't we just test it? Why don't we actually try and build some confidence and show people what's possible just for a short-term project? And lo and behold, the Downtown Merchants Association got on board with this idea and created a slogan called Downtown, drive to it, not through it. They also created some changes to a neighboring road in blue there, which took the emphasis off of Monterey Road, which is the main street, in orange. And another design and engineering firm worked up these 2 alternatives. And so you can see option 1 was removing a lane of traffic from our pedestrian space. Option 2 was actually just giving all that traffic lane over to a cycle lane. And then they called us up and said, can you help us actually now go and test this stuff out in the real world? So over the course of about 3.5 weeks, we worked with their city planning department, with the engineering department, with the local merchants, and with a whole bunch of volunteers to go out and build this. And all this kind of work relies on volunteers, on donations, on using the resources in your community to get these things done. Because now people feel a lot more vested and connected to the project as opposed to just dropping it in. So this is a local winery which had wine barrels. We're in wine country after all. And the resulting master plan that the city put forward on this 2-block test. And so alternative one, there's the wine barrels expanding the public space with the various different entities to test out what could work, what people thought of it. Alternative number 2, putting down the buffered bike lane. This was all volunteers, making what looks like a pretty professional buffered bike lane using what material we call traffic tape, which, by the way, you can order off the internet, and it's pretty low cost. It's non-reflective and non-stick, and it looks just like paint, and it comes right up. And so, there's some issues we had to deal with, like it actually rained. We were told it wouldn't rain. We're in a major drought in California, but it did. But we pulled feedback, and what we realized was, in the short term, people didn't really love this project as much as we had thought. It was kind of split, 50-50. But that was the whole power in this, is that we were able to daylight people's opinions about this whole thing. And that alone gave the city council enough confidence, whereas before they were on the fence, gave them enough confidence to actually consider doing a 6-month real pilot project for the transformation of their main street. And that's exactly what happened. And so starting in February of this year through August of this year, they're doing a 6-month pilot to understand what's working and what's not, knowing full well there might have to be some changes moving forward to their designs, but taking that data and putting that back in the planning process. So build, measure, learn. And I think that'll be it for me. So we have time for Ludo to share his stuff. But thank you.